The telegram arrived on a Tuesday in the spring of 1878, and it changed Olive Aldridge's life so completely that she would later say she could not imagine what she had been before it found her. She had been living in Cincinnati, Ohio, in a boarding house that smelled of boiled cabbage and damp wool, working 6 days a week as a seamstress for a dress shop on 5th Street. The work was honest and the pay was thin, and Olive did not complain about either because complaining required a kind of energy she had learned early in life to conserve. She was 24 years old, dark-haired, with green eyes the color of river glass and hands that were always slightly roughened from the needle and thread. She was not unhappy, exactly. She was simply waiting, though she could not have told you what she was waiting for. The telegram was from a woman named Mrs. Eleanor Fitch, a widow who lived outside of Abilene, Kansas, and who had known Olive's late mother from their school days together in Pennsylvania. Eleanor Fitch had herself moved west with her husband 12 years earlier, and since his passing from a fever 2 winters ago, she had become a kind of clearing-house for women seeking respectable employment in the territories. She knew everyone worth knowing from the Missouri River to the Colorado border, and she made it her personal mission to connect capable Eastern women with situations that needed them. The telegram read simply, "A rancher outside Harlow Creek needs a companion and tutor for his daughter aged 9. Situation is respectable and well compensated. Man is widower, runs Maddox Ranch, finest spread in that part of Texas. Girl named Clara needs steady female presence. Would you consider it? Reply at once." Olive read the telegram 3 times standing at the front window of the boarding house while the spring rain came down against the glass. She thought about the dress shop, about the smell of boiled cabbage, about the particular quality of gray that Cincinnati adopted in the rain, a gray that seemed to press down on everything and everyone beneath it. She thought about the boarding house mistress, Mrs. Hannigan, who was a perfectly decent woman but who watched Olive with the particular expression of a person watching something wasted. Olive sent her reply the following morning. She would go. She did not know what she expected. She had read enough newspaper accounts of the West to know that it was large and sun-baked and frequently dangerous, full of cattle drives and men who carried pistols on their hips in towns that erupted into violence over cards or cattle or water rights. She had read about the frontier with the mild alarm of someone reading about a foreign country they have no intention of visiting. And now here she was, buying herself a train ticket to Texas. It took her 4 days to settle her affairs in Cincinnati, which consisted mainly of giving notice to the dress shop owner, Mr. Presley, who accepted it with the philosophical resignation of a man who had watched 3 seamstresses leave for the West in as many years, and packing her 2 good dresses, her sewing kit, her small collection of books, and the miniature portrait of her mother into a trunk that she had borrowed from Mrs. Hannigan. She owned very little. This struck her, as she packed, as either very freeing or very sad, and she decided it was freeing because the alternative was too discouraging. The train journey west was unlike anything Olive had experienced in her life. She sat in the passenger car with her hands folded in her lap and watched the landscape of Ohio give way to Indiana, Indiana to Illinois, Illinois to Missouri, and then Missouri to something altogether different, something wider and more elemental, something that seemed to breathe differently than the land she had known. The sky got bigger. That was the first thing she noticed. Back east, the sky was something you glimpsed between buildings and trees, a pleasant backdrop to the actual business of living. Out here, the sky was the main event. It went on in every direction without apology, and the light that came through it was a quality of gold she had no prior reference for. She arrived in Abilene on a Thursday evening and spent the night with Eleanor Fitch, a small and energetic woman in her early 50s who talked for 3 hours straight over a supper of roasted chicken, and told Olive everything she needed to know about the Maddox Ranch and the man who ran it. George Maddox, Eleanor explained, was 31 years old. He had built his ranch from almost nothing, starting with a small herd, and a plot of land he had purchased after the war with money he had saved working for a trail boss out of San Antonio. He was not a man given to wasted words or idle sentiment, but he was fair and decent, and the kind of man whose handshake meant something in that part of the country. His wife, Nora, had died 3 years earlier from a difficult second pregnancy that neither she nor the baby survived. The loss had altered him, Elinor said carefully, not broken him, but altered him in the way that significant grief alters a person, as though certain rooms in a house are closed and locked, and no one speaks of what is inside them anymore. His daughter, Clara, was 9 years old and as bright as a new coin, and as stubborn as a fence post, Elinor said with affection. She had been largely without female guidance since her mother's death, cared for by a series of arrangements that had each proved inadequate in their own way. A housekeeper who left to marry a shopkeeper in Waco, a school teacher who came for 2 months and found the isolation too great, an older Mexican woman named Consolacion who had been genuinely wonderful but had gone back to her family in San Antonio the previous winter when her health began to fail. George Maddox had sent word to Elinor Fitch in something approaching desperation, and Elinor had thought immediately of Olive. "He is not looking for a wife," Elinor said, with the particular emphasis of a woman who wants to be certain she is understood. "He is looking for someone to give his daughter what she needs, and I told him I knew just the person." "I am not looking for a husband either," Olive said, and meant it. Elinor smiled the smile of a woman who has seen many things. The following morning, a man named Pete Dawson arrived at Elinor's house with a buckboard wagon to collect Olive and her trunk for the 3-hour drive southwest to Harlow Creek. Pete was George Maddox's ranch foreman, a bow-legged and cheerful man of about 40 with a sun-creased face and a tobacco-stained mustache, and the easy manner of someone who has spent so much time outdoors that indoor spaces make him slightly uncomfortable. He loaded Olive's trunk onto the buckboard with the efficiency of a man who has done such things 1,000 times, helped her up onto the seat with unexpected gentleness, and set the horses moving at a brisk clip southward. "You ever been to Texas before, miss?" he asked after about 10 minutes of comfortable silence. "I have not," Olive said. "Well," he considered this, "it's something." She found that she agreed, though she was still assembling exactly what it was. The land around them was vast and flat and interrupted by rolling rises of scrubby cedar and mesquite, and the sky pressed down in every direction with the particular intimacy of a place where there is nothing between you and everything. The air smelled of dry grass and something faintly mineral, like the smell of sun-warmed stone, and it was nothing like the damp urban air she had breathed for most of her life. Pete Dawson talked companionably as they drove, filling her in on the details of ranch life with the naturalness of a man who assumed she would find it interesting, which she did. There were currently 12 ranch hands working the Maddox spread, he told her, about 3,000 head of cattle on nearly 15,000 acres, and a few hundred horses, some of them among the finest in that part of Texas. The main house was solid and well built, put up 7 years ago when George had the money to do it right. There was a bunkhouse for the hands, a barn and stable, a smokehouse, a garden that had been left somewhat to its own devices since Consolacion left but was still producing. A one-room schoolhouse had been built on the property for Clara specifically, because the nearest actual school was 12 miles into town, and the road was not always reliable. "What is he like?" Olive asked. "Mr. Maddox." Pete Dawson was quiet for a moment, turning this over with the seriousness of a man who takes questions about other men seriously. "He is the best man I have ever worked for," he said finally. "And I do not say that to be complimentary. I say it because it happens to be true. He is hard when he needs to be hard and fair when he needs to be fair, and he knows the difference, which is rarer than you might think. He is not much for talking, but when he talks, it means something." Another pause. "He has had a hard several years. The loss of his wife hit him very deep. He does not show it, but it is there. And Clara." At this, Pete Dawson's face underwent a genuine transformation of warmth. "Clara is the best of him," he said simply. "She is bright and curious, and she has her mother's spirit and her father's stubbornness, and she has been waiting for someone like you with more patience than most adults could manage." Olive felt something soften in her chest at that. She had always been good with children. It was one of the things about herself she knew without vanity. The way she could talk to children as though they were small, complete people rather than incomplete adults, and they responded to it always. The Maddox ranch appeared on the horizon like something out of a painting, the main house white-painted and solid against the enormous Texas sky, surrounded by the working architecture of a thriving ranch. The red-painted barn, the long, low bunkhouse, the windmill turning slowly above the water tank, the cottonwood trees standing in a line along the creek that gave the nearby town its name. A herd of horses moved in the near pasture, and the whole scene was bathed in the particular amber light of a Texas afternoon that made everything look as though it had been gilded. Pete brought the buckboard to a stop in front of the main house, and before Olive could climb down properly, the front door flew open and a girl came out running with the specific urgency of someone who has been waiting at a window for a very long time. Clara Maddox was 9 years old and small for her age, with a thick braid of dark brown hair that bounced behind her as she ran, and a face that was still a child's face, but with something intensely watchful behind the eyes that made her seem older. She wore a plain cotton dress and boots that looked like they had spent significant time in the mud, and she stopped about 3 feet from the buckboard and looked up at Olive with an expression of open and serious evaluation. "You are Olive Aldridge," she said. "I am," Olive agreed. "My father said you are from Cincinnati." "That is correct. I have read about Cincinnati. It is on the Ohio River." "It is on the Ohio River," Olive confirmed. Clara appeared to reach some kind of internal conclusion. "I am glad you came," she said, and it was said with the directness of a child who has not yet learned to paper over her feelings with social convention. "I have needed someone to talk to." Olive felt the tightening in her chest again, that particular emotion that is halfway between tenderness and heartache. "Then it is a good thing I am here," she said. She was climbing down from the buckboard, accepting Pete's steadying hand, when she became aware of a man standing at the far end of the porch, and she looked up and found George Maddox watching her. He was taller than she had expected, broad through the shoulders in the way of a man who has spent years doing physical work, with dark hair that needed cutting and a jaw that was clean-shaved, but carried the dark promise of a beard that grew quickly. He wore a plain work shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbows and trousers tucked into worn boots, and he stood with the still, particular posture of a man who is comfortable in his own body and does not require an audience to confirm it. His eyes, even from this distance, were a striking color, a kind of gray-blue, the color of rain on distant hills, and they were fixed on her with an expression she could not immediately read. Not unfriendly, not welcoming exactly. Simply intent, as though she were something he was trying to take an accurate measure of. He walked toward her as she reached the ground, and they met at the bottom of the porch steps. He extended a hand without particular ceremony and she shook it. His hand was large and calloused and warm. "Miss Aldridge," he said. His voice was low and unhurried. "George Maddox, I am glad you made the journey." "Thank you for the position, Mr. Maddox," she said. "Your daughter came out to meet me with very little hesitation." Something shifted in his face at that, something that was almost a smile, not quite, but a movement in that direction, as though his face was considering the idea and not rejecting it entirely. "That is Clara," he said. "She does not do anything with hesitation." "Papa," Clara said, appearing at his elbow with the suddenness of a cat, "can Miss Aldridge have supper with us tonight instead of eating in the kitchen?" "She will eat with us every night," George said, without looking away from Olive. "Miss Aldridge is not staff. She is a guest and a member of this household." Something in the way he said it, the quiet firmness of it, the absence of condescension, made Olive want to think better of him than she had prepared herself to. She had spent the entire journey west mentally preparing to be tolerated, to be treated as a functional necessity somewhere in the social hierarchy between a servant and a relative, and she had accepted this in advance as fair given the nature of the arrangement. She had not expected to be declared, in 4 words, a member of this household. "Thank you," she said, and meant it more than the words alone could carry. He nodded once, as though the matter was settled, and turned to direct Pete about the trunk, and Olive watched him walk away and found, somewhat to her own annoyance, that she was still watching him when there was nothing new to observe. The first week at the Maddox ranch was an education in a dozen things simultaneously. Clara proved to be everything Pete Dawson had promised: bright, curious, relentlessly energetic, and possessed of a kind of raw intelligence that delighted Olive from the first morning they sat down together in the small schoolhouse with its 3 windows and its blackboard and its 2 shelves of books. Clara could already read well beyond her years, and her arithmetic was solid, and what she wanted most, she told Olive with characteristic directness on their first morning together, was to know everything. "Everything is a great deal," Olive said. "Then we had better start immediately," Clara said. They started with geography, which Clara absorbed with the intensity of someone memorizing a map to a buried treasure. They moved through history, through natural science, through literature, and Clara attacked each subject with the same open-mouthed hunger of a person tasting food for the first time. Olive found herself staying up later than she had intended each night, selecting passages to read aloud the following day, preparing lessons with a care and enthusiasm she had not brought to any work since she was a child herself and learning felt like breathing. In the evenings, she and George Maddox ate supper together with Clara at the long table in the dining room, and these meals became their own kind of education. George said little, but he was a good listener, the best kind, the kind who listens so thoroughly that when they do speak, you have the sense they have been turning the conversation over in their mind like a stone, looking at all sides of it. He asked Olive about Cincinnati, about her work there, about her family, and she answered honestly, telling him about the dress shop and the boarding house and her mother who had died when Olive was 15 and her father who had died when she was 20, leaving her alone in the world in the particular way that is not dramatic but simply true. He received this information without pity, which she appreciated. He said, "That is a hard thing," and he said it simply, without the performative sympathy that she had learned to dread, and then they went on talking about other things, and she felt, for the first time in a long time, that she had been met as an equal. She noticed, in those first weeks, that he looked at her, not in the way that made her uncomfortable, not with anything inappropriate or predatory in it, but with a quality of attention that was something more than polite interest. She would be reading to Clara at the supper table after the meal was cleared, and she would look up to find him watching her from across the table with those gray-blue eyes. She would be in the kitchen helping the cook, an older woman named Bessie who had been with the Maddox household for 5 years, and she would turn from the window to find him standing in the doorway longer than any particular errand required. She would be walking back from the schoolhouse in the late afternoon with Clara running ahead of her, and she would become aware that he had stopped whatever he was doing near the barn and was watching her cross the yard. She told herself it was simply the attention of a man evaluating whether an employee was doing their job. She told herself this very firmly and did not entirely believe it, and continued going about her business with the determined practicality of a woman who understands that some feelings are better not examined too closely until you understand more of what they are. Clara, who noticed everything and processed it with the unfiltered directness of a 9-year-old, said one afternoon, about 3 weeks into Olive's time at the ranch, "My father watches you when you are not looking." "Does he?" said Olive, not looking up from the arithmetic problem she was writing on the board. "He did not watch Mrs. Hartley that way," Clara said. Mrs. Hartley had been one of the previous arrangements, a woman from town who had come out 3 times a week and given up after 2 months. Or Consolacion, but she was old and he loved her like a grandmother. I imagine your father watches everyone when he is thinking about something, Olive said, which was true but also thoroughly evasive, and Clara looked at her with the particular expression of a child who knows she is being managed. I think he likes you, Clara said. That is very kind, Olive said. I like you too, Clara added, as though this settled something. I like you very much. Olive set down the chalk and looked at this small, serious girl and felt something in her that had been clenched for a very long time begin, very slowly to open. I like you too, Clara, she said. Very much indeed. The first real conversation she had with George, not a polite supper exchange or a practical matter about Clara's lessons or the schedule of the day, but a conversation that was something more, happened about a month after her arrival, on an evening in early May when the Texas sky was doing something extraordinary. The sunset had been building for an hour, layering itself in colors she had no names for, deep orange and violet, and a particular shade of rose gold that seemed to come from inside the light rather than reflecting it. And she had gone out to the porch after supper simply because she could not be indoors while something like that was happening outside. George was already there, sitting on the porch steps with a cup of coffee, looking at the sky the way he looked at everything, with that complete and unhurried attention. He had sent Clara to bed an hour earlier after a small and spirited argument about a chapter she wanted to finish, and the ranch was settling into its evening quiet, the sounds of the distant cattle, the horses moving in the near pasture, the soft percussion of the windmill. He did not say anything when she came out and leaned against the porch railing, but he did not need to. The silence between them was the good kind, the kind that is a form of company rather than an absence of it. Does it ever stop surprising you? Olive asked eventually, gesturing at the sky with a small movement of her coffee cup. The sky out here. He was quiet for a moment. No, he said. I have lived here for 11 years and it does not stop surprising me. He looked at it. I think that is one of the gifts of this country. It does not let you get complacent. What are the other gifts? She asked, and the question came out more genuinely curious than she had intended, without the careful distance she usually maintained. He turned his head and looked at her, and she held the look without dropping it. The space, he said. The way a man can be as large as his own effort will make him. No one cares who your father was or what part of town you came from. They care what you do and whether you stand by it. That is different from the East, she said. I know it. In the East there is a place for everyone, she said, and if you happen not to fit that place, it is considered your failure. She said it without bitterness, simply as a true thing observed. I did not fit very neatly into any of the available places. He looked at her for a moment with an expression that was unguarded in a way his face was not usually unguarded. No, he said quietly, I do not imagine you did. She did not know exactly what he meant by that, and she did not ask. But she carried the words with her to bed that night and lay for a time looking at the ceiling while the Texas stars through the window burned their particular cold, bright fire, and she felt something she had not felt in a very long time. She felt seen. As May deepened and June arrived with its vast warm days and its evenings that smelled of grass and sage, Olive settled into the rhythm of the Maddox ranch as naturally as though she had been born to it. She and Clara moved through their lessons each morning with increasing richness and depth, reading aloud, discussing what they read, filling the blackboard with equations and maps and the names of things. Clara was writing now, real writing, not just copywork but her own compositions, small fierce essays about the natural world she observed with such intensity, about the horses and the weather and the creek, and the particular behavior of the cattle when a storm was coming. Olive wrote alongside her. It felt important to model the thing she was asking Clara to do, to be a fellow learner rather than simply an authority, and she found, in the writing, that she was excavating parts of herself that had been set aside for the practical business of survival. She wrote about Ohio. She wrote about her mother. She wrote one afternoon about what it felt like to arrive in a place and find that it fit you in a way you had not expected and did not have prior words for. She did not show that particular one to Clara. In the afternoons, after lessons, she began to learn the ranch. This happened gradually and naturally through Clara, who wanted to show her everything and insisted on accompanying every discovery. They walked the creek, which was lined with cottonwoods and alive with small birds in the evenings. They visited the barn and the stable, where Clara introduced each horse by name and a summary of its personality, as though they were members of the household, which Clara clearly believed they were. They watched Pete Dawson and the other hands work the cattle with the easy competence of men who know their job deeply, and Olive found herself genuinely absorbed in the mechanics of it, the way a large and unwieldy animal could be directed by small, precise movements, the way men and horses communicated in a language that had no words. George sometimes crossed her path during these afternoon explorations, and he would stop what he was doing long enough to answer a question she had or to show her something Clara had not yet thought to include in her tour. He showed her the line of the property's southwest boundary, where a ridge of low hills broke the flat land and offered a view of the whole ranch below, the buildings small as toys, the cattle like moving dots, the land impossibly large in every direction. He showed her where the best water on the property ran, and explained the importance of water rights in that country with the gravity of someone explaining a matter of life and death, which he said it was. She began to understand that water in West Texas was not a convenience but a constant preoccupation, that the difference between a ranch that survived and one that didn't was often nothing more than who controlled the water and who didn't. There had been disputes with a neighboring rancher named Harlan Draper, who owned the spread to the east and who had, in the previous year, attempted to redirect a stream that fed one of the Maddox water tanks. George had handled this through legal means, hiring a lawyer from Abilene and presenting the established water rights documentation to the county court, and Harlan Draper had backed down, but the dislike between the two men had not resolved with the legal matter. It sat on the land between their properties like weather that has not yet decided what to do with itself. Olive learned about Harlan Draper gradually, through the way Pete Dawson mentioned him with a kind of careful neutrality, through the way the ranch hands shifted when his name came up, and through a direct encounter one afternoon in late June when she was in Harlow Creek on an errand with Pete and Clara, purchasing supplies and a new set of primers she had ordered from a bookseller in San Antonio. Draper was at the general store when they arrived, a large, red-faced man of about 50, with the particular confidence of someone who is accustomed to taking up more space than he is entitled to. He looked at Olive with a measuring appraisal that she disliked immediately, the way certain men look at women, calculating rather than seeing, and he tipped his hat with an exaggerated courtesy that managed to be contemptuous. "So this is the new addition to the Maddox household," he said, to no one in particular. George always did have an eye for the finer things. "I am Clara's companion and tutor," Olive said pleasantly, which was the tone she had found most effective with men like this, pleasantness deployed like a shield. "Miss Aldridge." "Olive Aldridge," he repeated, tasting the name in a way she did not like. "Long way from home, Miss Aldridge." "Not so far as it seems," she said, and turned away to examine the primer she had come to collect, and felt Clara's hand slide into hers with the small, fierce protectiveness of a child who knows when a situation needs claiming. She mentioned the encounter to George that evening, not with alarm, but matter-of-factly, because she thought he should know, and she watched something go briefly cold in his eyes before it was replaced by the steady composure that was his habitual expression. "Draper is not a man to be afraid of," he said, "but he is a man to be careful around. He does not have a great deal of regard for what belongs to others." It was the word belongs that caught at her attention, and she examined it later, alone, wondering what exactly he had meant by it. She decided he had meant the water rights, which was logical and true, and she let the matter rest there. July arrived with heat that was unlike anything Olive had experienced, a heat that had weight to it, a physical pressure that made the air visible above the flat ground and turned the distances into shimmering unreality. She adapted to it as she had adapted to everything about the ranch, not by surrendering to discomfort, but by understanding it and making accommodations. She wore lighter dresses, moved more slowly in the afternoons, scheduled the most vigorous lessons for the cooler mornings, and drank more water than she had ever thought to drink in Ohio. She and Clara conducted a survey of the wildflowers along the creek, pressing specimens into a book Clara had dedicated entirely to this purpose, labeling them with their common names and what she had read of their botanical names and any useful properties she could discover. George found them at this one afternoon, both of them on their knees in the grass beside the creek with the pressing book open between them, and he stood for a moment watching them with an expression that he did not know Olive could see because she was looking at him from beneath the brim of her hat. And what she saw in his face in that unguarded moment was something that she recognized because she had felt it herself. He was watching them, his daughter and this woman who had come into their lives from the other side of the country, and he was seeing something that he had been afraid to want. She looked away quickly, back to the flower Clara was holding up, and pretended she had not seen. But she had. That evening after Clara was asleep, Olive was sitting at the writing table in her room, which looked over the side yard toward the barn, when she heard footsteps on the porch below and then silence, and she knew without looking that it was him, standing there in the dark the way he did sometimes, looking at the sky or the land or simply standing because the outdoors was where he thought most clearly. She sat for a long moment without moving, the pen in her hand and the page blank before her, and then she set the pen down and went to her window and looked out. He was standing at the corner of the porch below, one hand on the railing, looking south toward the distant ridge, and the moon was full enough that she could see the line of his jaw and the set of his shoulders and the way he was absolutely, completely still in the way that only people who are deeply comfortable with themselves can be still. She did not call down to him. She simply looked for a moment, long enough to acknowledge to herself what she was feeling, and then she went to bed and lay in the warm dark with her heart doing something complicated inside her chest. She did not tell him this. She was not the sort of woman who declared things before she understood them, and she was not yet sure she understood this. What she understood was arriving in pieces, the way understanding often does when we are resisting it. She understood that she had begun to listen for his footsteps in the morning when the household was still quiet. She understood that she looked forward to supper with a warmth that was not entirely about the food. She understood that when he came into the schoolhouse one afternoon to check on a loose window latch and spent 20 minutes fixing it while she was teaching, she could not entirely locate her train of thought for the rest of the lesson. She understood that when he laughed, which was rare and therefore precious, the sound of it did something to the back of her knees. These were things she understood. She held them carefully and did not quite know what to do with them. The matter was brought to a kind of crisis, though that is a strong word for what was ultimately a quiet thing, in the second week of August. There was a social gathering in Harlow Creek, a summer dance held annually in the big barn at the edge of town, and it was the kind of occasion that drew everyone from the surrounding ranches and farms, a rare assembly of people who otherwise spent most of their days in the isolated working quiet of the land. George announced at supper the week before that they would be attending, and Clara exploded into a celebration of such pure and uncomplicated joy that even George smiled properly. Not almost smiled or considered it, but actually smiled, and Olive thought, not for the first time, that it rearranged his face entirely when he did that, made him look younger and less contained, and more like the man she suspected he was when he was not carrying everything he carried. They arrived at the dance in the late afternoon, the three of them together in the wagon, Pete Dawson having gone ahead with several of the other hands. Olive wore her better dress, the blue one with white trim at the collar and cuffs, and she had pinned her dark hair up in the way she had learned from the women in Cincinnati when there was somewhere worth going. She was not thinking about how she looked until she climbed down from the wagon and turned to find George watching her with an expression that was entirely unguarded for exactly 3 seconds before he arranged it back into something more neutral. 3 seconds was enough. The barn had been strung with lanterns and the local band, a fiddle player and a man with a guitar and a boy of about 15 on the harmonica, was already playing when they arrived. The smell of the place was good, hay and lamp oil, and the various foods people had brought, smoked meats and pies and cornbread, and things Olive did not have names for yet. Clara was absorbed immediately by a cluster of children her own age, and departed without looking back, which made both Olive and George laugh, which meant they were standing together laughing, which was a new thing between them. They moved through the gathering together with the ease of people who have established a comfortable orbit around each other. George introduced her to neighbors and ranchers and their wives, and she shook hands and smiled and answered questions about Ohio and Cincinnati and what she thought of Texas, and she felt the curious pleasure of being introduced as though she belonged there, as though she were not a transient person passing through, but someone with a fixed place in this man's world. Harlan Draper was there, as she had suspected he would be, and he made a point of finding them early in the evening and engaging George in a conversation about water rights that was social in its surface and hostile in its substance. Olive stood beside George and watched Draper's eyes move to her repeatedly in a way that made her understand that some part of his maneuvering had to do with her, a claim being staked or a challenge being issued in some language she did not fully speak. George answered him with the particular calm of a man who will not be provoked, and eventually Draper moved away, and George said quietly to Olive alone, "I apologize for that." "You have nothing to apologize for," she said. He looked at her. The band was playing something lively, and the room was loud and warm with the press of people, and he looked at her with the full weight of that gray-blue attention and said, "Would you dance with me, Miss Aldridge?" She said yes. She said it before the careful part of her mind had time to deliberate, and she felt the careful part of her mind note this with something between alarm and relief. He danced the way he did everything, without wasted movement, with a kind of quiet authority that was not about showing off, but about actually doing the thing. He put his hand at her waist and took her other hand in his and moved her through the dance with a steadiness that she found, almost immediately, deeply difficult to think around. She was aware of the warmth of his hand at her back and the careful, respectful distance he maintained, and the way he focused on her face while they danced as though the rest of the room had receded. "You dance well," she said, because she needed to say something. "My wife taught me," he said. "Nora, she was patient with it." It was the first time he had said his wife's name in front of her, and she felt the weight of it, the way it landed not painfully but solidly, like something real being put on the table between them. She thought of what a leaner Fitch had said about the closed rooms. "She sounds like she was wonderful," Olive said, which was what she genuinely believed. "She was," he said. "She was a good woman and she deserved more time." He said it with the simplicity of grief that has been lived with long enough to be true without being raw. Clara remembers her. I am glad of that. They finished the dance and stood for a moment in the warm noise of the barn, not quite separating, and George Maddox looked at Olive Aldridge with an expression that she would spend the next 3 days turning over in her mind. He looked as though he was trying to find the courage for something. She did not push it. She went to find Clara, who had gotten into a very spirited argument with a boy of about her age about whether horses or cattle were smarter, and who required an adult to broker a diplomatic resolution. By the time Olive had managed this, George was in conversation with another rancher across the room, and the moment had passed, and they drove home in the dark with Clara asleep between them, her head against Olive's shoulder, and the stars overhead were the kind of stars you never saw in Ohio, and Olive thought, in the pleasant sleepy warmth of the evening, that she had not been this close to happy in a very long time. The conversation happened 10 days later. It was not a grand romantic declaration. It was a late afternoon in the kitchen garden, where Olive was attempting to coax some order from the vegetables that had grown with more enthusiasm than direction since Consolacion had left. She had been out there for an hour pulling weeds with the focused satisfaction she found in physical work when she became aware that George was standing at the garden gate, watching her. "I have been meaning to say something to you," he said when she looked up. She straightened, pushing a loose strand of hair away from her face with the back of her wrist, and waited. He came into the garden and stopped a few feet from her, and he looked for once like a man who does not know exactly what he is doing, which was so unlike his usual ease that she found it almost more moving than whatever he was about to say. "I was not expecting you," he said. "Beg your pardon. When I wrote to Alina Fitch asking for someone to come for Clara, I was not expecting—" He stopped. "I was not expecting someone like you." "What were you expecting?" she asked, and her voice came out quieter than she had intended. He looked at her for a moment and then, with the manner of a man who has decided that if he is going to do a thing he will do it completely, he said, "Someone adequate, someone kind enough and capable enough to give Clara what she needs. Someone I could be grateful for from a respectful distance." A pause. "I was not expecting someone I cannot stop thinking about." Olive felt the garden around her go very still, the way the air goes still before a change in weather. "I know this is not what you were brought here for," he continued, and his voice was steady but his jaw was tight with the effort of it. "I know it may be unwelcome, and if it is, you may tell me plainly and I will not mention it again, and nothing will change between us with respect to this household and your position here, and that is not an empty promise. I am not a man who makes empty promises." "I know that about you," she said. He waited. She looked at this man, this contained and steady and quietly remarkable man who had spent 3 years learning to live with absence, and had built a life of purpose and decency in the doing of it. And she thought about what she had felt watching him from her window in the moonlight, and what she had felt when his hand was at her back on the dance floor, and what she had felt every single morning when she heard his footsteps in the hallway and knew that the day was beginning, and he was part of it. "It is not unwelcome," she said. He exhaled once, a controlled breath, but she saw in his eyes what the words did to him. "Miss Aldridge, Olive," she said. "I think at this point you may call me Olive." He looked at her and the almost smile was back and closer to becoming real than she had ever seen it. "Olive," he said. And then he said, "George, if that is agreeable." "It is agreeable," she said. He reached out then and took her hand, just her hand, and held it in both of his the way he had held it on the first day they met, when it was merely a handshake, and she felt the warmth of it travel up her arm and settle somewhere near her heart. "I do not want to rush anything," he said. "I want to be honest with you and careful with you and to do this right." "I think the same," she said. They stood in the kitchen garden in the slant light of the Texas afternoon, with the windmill turning in the distance and the smell of warm earth around them. And it was, Olive thought, very nearly perfect. Clara knew within approximately 2 days. She said nothing directly, because she was 9 years old, but she was also a person of genuine sophistication when it mattered, but her behavior underwent a subtle and unmistakable shift. She arranged, with the strategic genius of a child who wants 2 things to happen, to disappear precisely when her father and Olive might otherwise be alone together, inventing errands to the barn or books she urgently needed to retrieve from the schoolhouse. She began asking Olive questions about what she liked to eat and what flowers she liked best and what she thought of Texas in the autumn, and then reporting the answers to her father with the studied casualness of a small agent in her own cause. She said to Olive, about a week after the garden conversation, with an air of someone raising a perfectly routine topic, "I think it would be nice if you stayed here forever." "I intend to stay as long as I am wanted," Olive said carefully. You will always be wanted, Clara said, with the certainty of a prophet. September brought a cooling that felt like a gift after the long summer, the air losing its heaviness and becoming something you could breathe more easily, the evenings dropping to a coolness that made the stars sharpen overhead. Olive began riding in the mornings, something she had not done before in her life, but that George taught her with the quiet patience he brought to everything, starting her on a gentle mare named Rosie and accompanying her on the trails around the property until she had the basic confidence to sit a horse without looking as though she expected it to kill her. She was not an immediate talent. This was evident. But she had determination and no pride about her lack of skill, and George turned out to be a good teacher, direct and clear, and without the condescension that some men brought to instructing women in outdoor things. He rode beside her on his big gray gelding, which was named Mac and which was the finest horse on the ranch, and he talked her through what she needed to do and told her when she was doing it right and what to correct when she was not. And on the mornings when they rode out together before the day's work began, Olive felt such a particular quality of happiness that she sometimes had to remind herself to breathe. One morning in late September, riding along the top of the southwest ridge with the whole ranch spread below them in the early light and the sky turning pink and then gold above the distant horizon, George pulled Mac to a stop and sat looking at the view for a moment, and Olive pulled Rosie up beside him and looked too. I built all of it from nothing, he said, not with pride exactly, but with the quiet satisfaction of a man who has done what he set out to do. When I came out here I had $800 and a plan and no guarantees at all. Were you afraid? She asked. He looked at her. Every single day, he said. The fear does not go away. You just learn to act in spite of it. She thought about this. That seems like a good definition of courage, she said. He looked at her for a long moment, the gold light across his face, and then he said, I was afraid to say what I said to you in the garden. I had not said anything like it to anyone since Nora. He paused. I want you to know that it was not said lightly. I know it wasn't, she said, and it was not received lightly. He reached across the space between their horses and took her hand where it rested on the pommel, and they stayed like that for a moment, the two of them on horseback above the ranch in the early morning light, and Olive thought, this is it. This is the thing I have been waiting for without knowing I was waiting for it. This specific thing. October came in with its perfect blue days and its cool evenings, and the changes between George and Olive were both subtle and profound. They did not conduct themselves with impropriety. He was a man of honor and she was a woman of dignity, and neither of them would have wished for anything less. But there was a quality to their evenings together, after Clara was in bed, sitting on the porch with the cooling air around them, that had changed from the early weeks when they had been carefully polite strangers finding each other out. There was ease now. There was the pleasure of a shared understanding, the way a long acquaintance allows for a shorthand that does not require everything to be explained. He told her things he had not told anyone, about the years of the war and what they had cost him in some nameless interior way, about what it had been like to be young and alone and building something in a country that was still itself being built. She told him about her mother, really told him, about who she was and what she had meant, and how losing her at 15 had changed the shape of Olive's life in ways she was still discovering. He listened in the way he always listened, completely and without interruption, and when she was finished he said nothing for a moment, and then he said, she would have been proud of you, simply and without embellishment. She did not cry. She came close. The trouble with Harlan Draper came to a head in November, and it was not about water rights this time. Olive had been in town on her own, which she now did comfortably, driving the small buggy George had designated for her use, collecting her regular order from the post office, and purchasing some fabric for a project she and Clara had conceived, a set of curtains for the schoolhouse windows that Clara had decided were insufficiently cheerful. She was loading her purchases into the buggy when Draper appeared at her elbow, and even in a public street in daylight, his manner carried the particular unpleasantness of someone who has decided they are entitled to something that has not been offered. He made a series of comments, ostensibly social, that were designed to unsettle her, insinuations about her arrangement at the Maddox ranch, suggestions about what exactly her role there might be, all of it delivered in the smooth, surface tone of polite conversation with the ugliness entirely in the content. Olive listened to the first of these with composure, replied that she was Clara's tutor and companion, and that Mr. Maddox was the most decent employer and gentleman she had encountered. And when Draper continued, she turned away and climbed into the buggy and drove back to the ranch with her back straight and her hands steady on the reins. She told George that evening, and she watched his jaw set. "He has been looking for a way to make trouble," George said. "He did not manage it with the water rights, and so he is trying this. I will speak to him." "I would rather you did not make it larger than it is," Olive said. "I am not distressed by Harlan Draper. I have managed worse than him." He looked at her for a moment with an expression that contained something she recognized as the tension between his own desire to act and his respect for her judgment. "If he speaks to you that way again," he said finally, "I would like to know about it." "You will know about it," she said. He nodded. Then he said, "Olive," and stopped. "What is it?" He looked at her with the full, unguarded weight of his eyes and said, "I would not have you treated with anything less than the respect you deserve. Not by him, not by anyone, and I am sorry if the nature of your position here has left you open to that." "The nature of my position here," she said, "is the best thing that has ever happened to me. I would not trade it for any amount of freedom from Harlan Draper's opinions." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "I am going to ask you something, and I want you to know that whatever your answer is, what I said in September holds and nothing changes." She waited, her heart doing that complicated thing again. "I have been thinking," he said, with the care of a man who wants to get the words exactly right, "about whether you might consider making your situation here permanent, not as Clara's tutor, not as a member of the household in the arrangement you came in." He paused. "As my wife." The porch was very quiet around them. The night sounds of the ranch came from a distance, and the stars were out and the air was cool on Olive's face, and she sat very still for a moment, not because she was uncertain, but because she wanted to be fully present for this, wanted to feel the whole weight of it, the extraordinary fact of it. "George Maddox," she said, and her voice was steady and warm, "I came to Texas to be a companion to your daughter, and I have found, quite without intending to, that I have become entirely unwilling to be anywhere you are not. And so the answer is yes." He reached across and took her hands in both of his and held them, and his eyes were bright in a way that had nothing to do with the light, and she thought again that his face did extraordinary things when he was not managing it. "Yes," he said, as though confirming something. "Yes," she said again. He kissed her then, carefully and with great tenderness, and the night was wide and warm around them, and somewhere inside the house, in her small bedroom on the second floor, Clara Maddox was almost certainly not asleep. Clara was, in fact, not asleep. They learned this approximately 30 seconds later when a small face appeared at the upstairs window and said, in a voice of concentrated triumph, "I knew it." George looked up at his daughter with an expression that was helpless with laughter, and Olive hid her face briefly in her hands, and Clara disappeared from the window, and in the morning she came to breakfast with the glowing composure of someone who has been proven correct about something important, and she ate her eggs and said very solemnly, "I am very pleased about this." And then she applied herself to her biscuit. They were married in December, 2 weeks before Christmas, in the small church in Harlow Creek. It was a quiet ceremony, attended by Pete Dawson and most of the ranch hands, by Eleanor Fitch, who had made the journey from Abilene with the visible satisfaction of a woman who has accomplished something she is proud of, by a handful of George's neighbors and friends, and by Clara, who served as the best possible witness that a wedding could have. standing beside Olive in her best dress with her hair pinned up for the first time, and her face carrying the expression of someone attending the most important event of their life. Olive wore a dress that she had made herself, ivory wool with a high collar and pearl buttons down the front, and she carried a small bunch of dried wildflowers that Clara had gathered and pressed and tied with a blue ribbon. George wore his good suit, dark charcoal with a white shirt, and he looked at her when she walked toward him down the narrow aisle of the church with the full, undivided attention of a man who cannot believe his luck, and she looked back at him with the full, undivided attention of a woman who intends to spend the rest of her life being worth the looking. The minister read the words that had been read at 1,000 such ceremonies before theirs, but they were not diminished by the repetition. When George said, "I do," his voice was quiet and certain, the voice of a man who understands what he is promising and means every word of it. When Olive said, "I do," she felt the words come from a place so deep and decided in her that they seemed to have been true before she said them. They put a ring on her finger, a plain gold band that had been his grandmother's, which George had kept all these years in a cedar box in the top drawer of his desk, with the kind of patient faith that makes a person believe in things working out the way they should. Clara cried, which surprised everyone including Clara, and she cried with the wholehearted lack of self-consciousness of a child who knows that what is happening is worth crying about. Pete Dawson, at the reception dinner in the church hall, made a toast that was brief and heartfelt, and concluded with the observation that in 11 years of working for George Maddox, he had never seen the man look the way he had looked for the past several months, and that whatever Miss Aldridge, now Mrs. Maddox, had done, he intended to be grateful to her for it for the rest of his natural life. There was considerable agreement expressed to this, and considerable drinking of the punch that one of the ranch wives had brought, which turned out to be more potent than it appeared, and the evening was warm and loud and full of the specific joy that is generated when people who have worked hard in a difficult country gather together to celebrate something purely good. Olive danced with her husband, and this time there was nothing careful about it. The winter was mild that year, as Texas winters often are, and the ranch settled into a domestic rhythm that was different from any Olive had known. She was still Clara's teacher, had no intention of stopping that, and Clara's education continued to deepen and expand with the enthusiasm of a student who has found her purpose. But now in the evenings, when the lessons were done and supper was finished, and Clara was tucked in with her book, Olive sat with her husband in the warm parlor, and they talked or read or simply were in the same space in the profound comfort of people who have chosen each other and know it. She learned him in the winter. Learned the particular quality of his silences and what they each meant, the comfortable silences and the pensive ones, and the occasional brief dark silences that were the residue of grief or worry, and that he needed to move through at his own pace without company. Learned that he woke before dawn every day and went out to check on the horses before anything else in the morning, and that if you wanted to find him in a troubled state, you would find him with the horses, whose company he seemed to find clarifying. Learned that he kept a journal, something she had not expected, small leather-bound notebooks in the desk drawer beside his grandmother's rings now empty cedar box, and that he wrote in them not with any particular literary ambition, but to keep account of things, the weather and the cattle and the work of the ranch. And now and then, she discovered one evening when he handed her one to read, something that was simply the honest record of what he was thinking. She read one entry, written in October, before she knew he had seen her watching him or what he had been feeling. It read, "The woman is extraordinary. I do not know what to do with that. I have been trying to figure out what to do with it for 2 months." She looked up from the journal and he was watching her from across the room with a half-smile. "You could have told me sooner," she said. "I could have," he agreed. Harlan Draper proved in the end to be a problem that resolved itself. In early spring of the new year, news came through Harlow Creek that Draper had sold his spread east of the Maddox property to a family from Oklahoma, a young couple with 3 children who had been looking for good ranch land. George met them at their arrival and spent a day showing them the lay of the land, and came home that evening saying they seemed like decent people and that he intended to be a good neighbor to them. As opposed to, Olive said. As opposed to, he confirmed. Spring came to the ranch with the particular extravagance of a Texas spring, which was not the modest, tentative spring of Ohio, but something bold and colorful and sudden. The hills going green overnight, and the wildflowers coming up in such quantity that riding out in the morning felt like riding through a painting. Clara was beside herself with the flower-pressing book, filling pages daily, and Olive found herself equally enchanted, writing long letters to Eleanor Fitch describing the landscape with a detail that was, she suspected, slightly embarrassing in its enthusiasm. Eleanor wrote back that she was not surprised, that Texas had this effect on people who came to it with open eyes, and that she was very pleased about how things had turned out, and that she intended to visit in the fall and expected to be shown everything. In April, Olive discovered that she was expecting a child. She told George on a Tuesday evening after Clara was in bed, sitting across from him at the kitchen table with her hands folded and her composure entirely deliberate, because what she was feeling was large enough that she needed the composure to counterbalance it. He was very still for a moment. And then something moved across his face that she had never seen before, a feeling so raw and complete and unguarded that she felt her own eyes fill, and he came around the table and he gathered her against him with the careful strength of a man who is aware he is holding something precious, and he held her there for a long time without saying anything. "George," she said, into his shoulder. "I know," he said into her hair. "I know." He was, in the weeks that followed, magnificent in ways she had not anticipated. He was attentive without being hovering, which was the precise calibration she needed. He arranged for the doctor from Harlow Creek to visit regularly, and he consulted with Bessie about everything related to the domestic management of a household with a pregnant woman in it. And he did all of this with the quiet, practical care that was simply his nature, and that Olive had come to understand was one of the most substantial forms of love. Clara received the news of the forthcoming sibling with an enthusiasm so intense it required some management. She declared immediately that the child should be named either Samuel, if it was a boy, or Eleanor after Mrs. Fitch, if it was a girl, and she began knitting a blanket of very earnest but uneven craftsmanship that she refused all assistance with on the grounds that it needed to be made by her specifically. The months of the pregnancy moved through the summer and into the fall with a rhythm that was, on balance, more good than difficult. Olive continued teaching Clara and managing the household and riding Rosie, more gently now, but she refused to stop entirely, and George deferred to her judgment on this with some visible effort and only one direct expression of worry, which she received and addressed, and which he did not repeat. Eleanor Fitch arrived in September as promised, and she was as vigorous and delightful in person as she had been in letters, a small woman who moved through the ranch with the energy of someone 20 years younger, and who took one long look at Olive and George at supper on her first evening and said, with the satisfaction of someone reviewing accomplished work, "Well, I have outdone myself." George looked at her with a dry composure. "We are grateful, Eleanor," he said. "You should be," she said cheerfully, and helped herself to more biscuit. Eleanor spent 2 weeks at the ranch, and they were 2 of the best weeks Olive had experienced there, not because any single thing happened, but because having Eleanor present added a layer of warmth and female companionship that Olive had not known she was missing. They sat together on the porch in the evenings and talked in the way of women who respect each other and have things to say, and Eleanor told her about her own life in Texas, the years with her husband, the loss of him, the way she had rebuilt her life around purpose and connection, and Olive listened and recognized in it something about resilience that she wanted to remember. On Aline's last evening, they sat on the porch in the cooling September air while George and Pete Dawson were in the barn with a mare that was having a difficult foaling, and Aline looked at Olive's face for a long moment and said, "You are happy." "I am very happy," Olive said. "Good," Aline said simply. "You were made for happiness. I could see it in Cincinnati the first time I met you, underneath all the practicality. Something in you that was looking for the right conditions." "I did not know I was looking," Olive said. "That is usually how it works," Aline said. The baby arrived in December, a year almost to the day after their wedding, in the deep of a cold Texas night with the sky outside the bedroom window full of the hard, bright stars of winter. The doctor was there, and Bessie was there, and the birth was, by the standards of such things, blessedly uncomplicated. And at 4 in the morning, a boy came into the world with a voice that left no one in any doubt of his presence. George held his son for the first time with the particular stillness of a man who has been brought to the absolute limit of what he can contain, and is holding very carefully because of it. He looked down at the small red face, and then he looked at Olive, who was exhausted and clear-eyed and entirely present, and he said, "He is perfect." "He is," Olive agreed. They named him Thomas, which was George's father's name, and they gave him the middle name of James for no more particular reason than that it suited him. And Clara, admitted to the bedroom in the early morning with her hair loose and her face incandescent with the wonder of it, held her brother for the first time with an expression of such profound and newly discovered love that both George and Olive had to look away for a moment, because some things are private even when they happen in a room full of people. Clara's uneven knitted blanket proved to be exactly the right size for Thomas, who wore it with the royal indifference of a small person who does not yet understand textile craftsmanship, but who is warm and therefore not complaining. The months that followed Thomas's birth were full and good, in the way that the months with a new child are full and good, which is to say they were occasionally exhausting and sometimes frightening, and always remarkable. Olive found in herself a capacity for this particular kind of love that she had suspected was there, but had never had occasion to test, a love that was both overwhelming and completely natural, as though her life had been arranging itself toward this specific person without her knowledge. George was a father to Thomas the way he was everything else, fully and without reservation. He came in from the work of the ranch in the evenings, and he held his son, and talked to him in the low, steady voice he used for the horses, as though the continuity of speech was more important than whether it was understood, and Thomas regarded him with the profound, focused attention of a baby who is taking everything in and has opinions about it already. Clara, at 10 now, was an extraordinary sister. She read to Thomas from the very beginning not board books but her actual books, the books she and Olive worked through together, sitting with him in the armchair by the parlor window and reading aloud in the serious instructional tone of someone who intends to give her brother the best possible start on understanding literature. Thomas appeared to enjoy this, or at minimum he fell asleep to it, which Clara accepted as appreciation. Spring came again, the second spring of their marriage, and it was better than the first because now it was known. Now it had the quality of something anticipated and recognized rather than discovered. And Olive rode Rosie through the wildflowers with Thomas strapped to her front in the carrier that one of the ranch wives had shown her how to make. And she thought that the Ohio Olive, the one who sat in the Cincinnati boarding house smelling boiled cabbage and waiting for something she could not name, would not have believed this was coming for her. She thought about this often, the geography of chance, the extraordinary sequence of small decisions and accidents and connections that had delivered her to this specific place, this specific man, this specific life. Aline Fitch's friendship with her mother, the telegram on a Tuesday in spring, the buckboard ride from Abilene and Pete Dawson's cheerful account of the man she was going to work for, the first sight of George standing at the corner of his porch, looking at her with that measuring gray-blue attention. Clara flying out of the front door to meet her. Every small thing had been necessary. Every small thing had been, in its way, a kind of grace. She wrote to her old friend Margaret in Cincinnati that spring, a letter of considerable length, describing her life with the honest detail of someone who wants the picture to be accurate. She wrote about the ranch and the land and the wildflowers, about the particular quality of the Texas sky, about teaching Clara, about Thomas. She wrote about George last and with the most care, choosing her words the way she had always chosen them, slowly and deliberately, because some things require the right words or not words at all. She wrote, "He is the kind of man who means what he says and says only what he means, and I did not know before him how rare that is. I came here thinking I was coming to do a job, and I found instead that I was coming to find the thing I had been looking for without knowing I was looking. I am aware this sounds sentimental, and I find I am entirely comfortable with that." Margaret wrote back that she was delighted and that Cincinnati was still very gray. The summer of 1880 was a good one for the Maddox ranch. The cattle prices were strong and the water had been adequate, and the new neighbors to the east, the family from Oklahoma, had proved to be exactly the decent people George had hoped for. He worked hard, as he always had, from before dawn to after dark in the busy seasons, and Olive watched him with the appreciation of someone who understands what it costs and values the result. And when he came in at the end of the day and washed the dust off at the basin and sat down at the supper table, she felt his presence as the specific weight of home. Clara, at 10 going on 11, was advancing through her education at a pace that made Olive begin to think seriously about what came after the schoolhouse, what the next step would be for a mind like this one. She raised the subject with George on an evening in August, sitting on the porch in the warm dark with Thomas asleep inside and Clara in her room reading with the lamp. "There are boarding schools," she said, "in San Antonio, good ones. I have been writing to inquire about them." George was quiet for a moment. "She is 10, he said. "She is almost 11, and there is a limit to what I can give her, George. She needs teachers who know more than I do in certain areas, mathematics beyond what I have. Sciences. She has an extraordinary mind, and I do not want it to be limited by the limits of my own knowledge." He looked out at the dark land and was quiet for a while. "Not for a few years," he said finally, "not before she is old enough." "When she is 13, Olive said. "I think 13 would be right. That gives us 2 more years together here, and then she goes to San Antonio knowing everything I can give her and ready for more." He considered this. Then he turned and looked at her with that full attention. "How do you do that?" he asked. "Do what?" "Know exactly what the right thing is for her." He said it with a kind of wonder that was not quite contained. "You came here as a stranger, and now you know her better than most people who have known her since she was born." "I love her," Olive said simply. "That is most of it. The rest is just paying attention." He reached across and put his hand over hers on the railing. "You are the best thing that has happened to this family," he said. "I want you to know that I know that." "You are the best thing that has happened to me," she said. "So we are even." Thomas, who had presumably been listening from wherever babies listen from, made a sound from inside the house that indicated his opinion of the matter, and they both laughed, and George went in to see to him, and Olive stayed on the porch for a moment in the warm Texas night, and listened to the sound of her husband's voice through the window talking to their son, and the feeling that moved through her was so enormous and so complete that she had no word for it in any language she had ever learned. She thought briefly that she would have to invent one. In the fall of that year, Pete Dawson announced, with the sheepish dignity of a man who has been ambushed by his own feelings, that he intended to marry the widow Calloway from the edge of town, a woman named Ruth who had 3 children of her own, and who had apparently decided, after considerable deliberation, that Pete Dawson was a worthy proposition. George shook his hand with genuine warmth, and the whole ranch celebrated with the enthusiasm of people who take pleasure in each other's good fortune. And the wedding, held in the same small church where George and Olive had been married nearly 2 years earlier, was the occasion for a party that lasted until the small hours, and was remembered in Harlow Creek for the better part of a decade. Olive and Ruth Dawson became friends quickly and naturally, in the way that women in isolated places often form friendships, with the efficiency of people who recognize the value of female company in a country that can sometimes feel very large and very male. Ruth was practical and funny and entirely without pretension, and she and Olive spent Sunday afternoons on each other's porches with the children running around them, and talked with the ease of people who have no need to perform for each other. Clara, at 12, was becoming a young woman with the specific intensity of a person in whom everything is happening at once. She was taller, more private, more conscious of the world beyond the ranch in ways that were both natural and a little bittersweet to observe. She still had lessons with Olive every morning, still pressed flowers in her book and read with Thomas in the parlor chair, and rode with her father in the early mornings, but there was a quality of reaching in her now, a reaching toward what came next, that Olive recognized and took seriously. She had been corresponding with the San Antonio Girls' Academy, and the letters had been encouraging. The school had strong programs in literature, mathematics, and the natural sciences, and they had accepted Clara's application for the following autumn, when she would be 13. Clara received the news with a mixture of excitement and something that was not quite fear, but was adjacent to it, that particular anxiety of a person approaching a door they have wanted to open and now must actually go through. She and Olive spent an evening together, just the two of them, talking about it in the way they talked about everything, directly and without the social varnish that makes difficult conversations slippery. "I will miss this," Clara said, meaning all of it, the ranch and the schoolhouse and the mornings and Thomas and her father and Olive. "And we will miss you enormously," Olive said. "Every day. But this is the right thing, Clara." "You have known it is the right thing." "What if I am not good enough?" Clara said, which was so unlike her that it revealed how genuinely uncertain she was. "That is not a real concern," Olive said firmly. "You are one of the most capable students I have ever known, and I include in that assessment people considerably older than you. The academy will discover this within a week." Clara was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You will write to me, every week." "Every week without fail," Olive promised. "And you will write to me, and to your father, who will worry more than he shows." "He always worries more than he shows," Clara said. "It is his particular gift," Olive agreed. Clara went to San Antonio in the autumn, which was the autumn of 1881, and the morning she left on the stage from Harlow Creek was one of the harder mornings of that year. George stood very straight and held his daughter for a long time, and Clara, who had not cried since Thomas was born, pressed her face against his chest for just a moment before she straightened and climbed into the stage with the composure of someone who has decided that if you are going to do a hard thing, you do it decisively. She waved from the window as the stage pulled away, and the image of her face at that window was something Olive carried for a long time, the particular mixture of courage and love and the threshold of the rest of her life. She wrote, that first month, every single week as promised. The letters were long and detailed and full of Clara's particular voice, the observations of a mind that takes nothing for granted, descriptions of her teachers and classmates, and the city of San Antonio, which she found overwhelming and fascinating in equal measure. She was doing well academically, which surprised no one, and she had made a friend named Sophie from Houston who was, Clara wrote, possibly the only other person she had met who had opinions about the migratory patterns of birds. George read every letter twice and wrote back with the same care he brought to everything, in his clear, steady handwriting, telling her about the ranch and Thomas's latest achievements in the ongoing project of learning to walk, and about the horses and the weather and the things she knew and loved. Olive added postscripts to every letter, sometimes a page long, because a postscript that was a page long was simply a letter, and Clara deserved letters. Thomas, at 2, was a person of considerable personality, which surprised no one who had met his parents and his sister. He was broad-shouldered and dark-haired like his father, and had his mother's green eyes, a combination that suggested he would be difficult to say no to when he was older, and he moved through the ranch with the confidence of a small person who has been told he belongs everywhere in it. He followed George into the barn and the stable, and watched the horses with the focused attention of a child already understanding something. He followed Olive into the kitchen garden and crouched beside her to look at things in the earth and asked questions in the concentrated vocabulary of a 2-year-old that were really more profound than they sounded. "What is this?" Pointing at a worm. "That is a worm. It lives in the soil and helps the garden grow." "Why?" "Because that is its purpose." "What is my purpose?" Thomas asked with the magnificent seriousness of a person who genuinely wants to know. Olive sat back on her heels and looked at her son, and felt the particular quality of love that arrives in the ordinary moments, the unremarkable Tuesday afternoon moments that are actually not unremarkable at all. "That," she said, "is something you get to decide for yourself, but you have a very long time to figure it out." Thomas appeared to find this satisfactory. He went back to observing the worm. The years moved in the way that good years move, with a forward momentum that does not feel like loss because everything it moves through is worth having. The ranch grew and prospered, George adding acreage to the southwest of the property when the opportunity arose, and building a second barn that Pete Dawson and the hands put up over the course of 3 weeks in the spring, with the communal energy of people who take satisfaction in making a thing. The cattle operation expanded, the horses were bred with increasing selectivity, and the Maddox ranch became, over time, exactly the kind of place that people in that part of Texas knew about and pointed to when they talked about what the country was capable of producing. Clara came home for Christmas every year, and each year she came home more completely herself, which was not less but more than she had been. The full flowering of everything that had been in her since Olive first met her at 9 years old, running out of that door with her muddy boots and her total lack of hesitation. She was, by 17, formidable in the best sense of the word, a young woman of precise intelligence and strong character, and the kind of warm, blunt honesty that her father had in him too, that way of saying the real thing directly rather than dancing around it. She adored Thomas, who adored her back with the devoted intensity of a small brother for an older sister who takes him seriously. When Clara was home, she read to him every evening and took him on exploratory walks along the creek and taught him the names of every wildflower she had catalogued in her pressing book, which she still kept, now fat with years of specimens and careful notation. In the spring of 1884, Olive discovered she was expecting their second child, and she told George on the porch in the same manner as the first time, with her hands folded and her composure deliberate, and he responded in the same manner, gathering her against him with the careful strength of a man who is aware of holding something precious. And this time Thomas was there too, at their feet, looking up at them with the puzzled expression of a child who does not yet understand what the embrace is about but knows it is significant. "We are going to have a brother or sister for you," Olive told him, setting him on her knee. Thomas considered this with great seriousness. Then he said, "I want a brother." "We will see what comes," George said with a straight face. What came in November of that year was a girl, born on a cold, clear morning with the frost on the windows and the smell of wood smoke in the house, and they named her Nora after the woman who had come before and whose absence had shaped them all, which felt right, which felt like the kind of completion that life sometimes offers if you are paying attention. George held his daughter for the first time with the stillness he had brought to holding Thomas, but there was something additional in it now, something private and layered, and Olive, watching him from the bed where she was resting, understood without asking what he was carrying in that moment. She reached out and put her hand on his arm, just her hand, simply that, and he looked at her with eyes that were full of everything, grief and gratitude and the enormous ongoing fact of love. "She has your eyes," he said. "She has your chin," Olive said. Thomas, brought in to meet his sister, looked at her with the cautious assessment of a 4-year-old evaluating a decision he did not entirely make. Then he said, "She is very small." "She will grow," Clara said from behind him. Clara had come home from San Antonio for the birth, having refused to do otherwise. "When?" Thomas asked. "Quickly," Olive said. "Faster than you will expect." She was right. She was right about most things, which George had long since acknowledged with the straightforward honesty that was one of the things she loved most about him. He had told her once, in a late evening conversation that had moved from practical matters to the deeper kind, that she had changed the way he saw things. Not replaced what was there before, he said carefully, because the past was the past and everything in it mattered, but had opened doors in him that he had thought were permanently shut. Had let light into rooms that had been dark for a long time. She had said, "You did the same for me, in different rooms." He had looked at her for a moment and then said, "I suppose that is what love is in the end, the willingness to open the rooms." She thought it was the most precise description she had ever heard. Nora grew, as promised, quickly. She was a quiet child compared to Thomas, which was perhaps inevitable given Thomas's volume, but quiet in the way of someone who is absorbing a great deal. The way her father was quiet, taking everything in with those green eyes and processing it at depth. She followed George everywhere from the moment she could walk, a small shadow in his footsteps around the ranch, and he brought her along on everything the way he had once brought Clara, explaining what he was doing, and why with the same patient seriousness he brought to all instruction, and she listened with the focused attention of a student who intends to remember. Clara graduated from the San Antonio Academy in 1886, at the age of 17, with the highest marks in her year in natural sciences. She came home for the summer before deciding what came next, and the summer she spent on the ranch was one of the best they had, all 5 of them together in the full ease of a family that has found its shape. She and Thomas went on long rides in the evenings, racing each other across the lower pastures with a freedom that made Olive stand at the gate and watch them with her hand shading her eyes and something so warm in her chest, it was difficult to locate where it stopped. She and George sat on the porch one evening in August and listened to the sounds of their children inside, Thomas's voice high and rapid, Clara's measured and amused, Nora's occasional interjection in the clear bell tone she was developing, and they did not need to say anything. The silence was the good kind, the richest kind, the kind that can only exist between 2 people who have told each other everything that needed telling and arrived at the place where presence itself is enough. "Are you happy?" he asked her after a time, the same question Alina Fitch had asked her years ago, and it deserved the same answer and more. "Completely," she said, "entirely, without reservation." He looked at her, this woman who had come from Cincinnati on a train with a borrowed trunk and 2 good dresses and a quality of waiting in her that had needed the right place to resolve itself, and he said, "Good. That was all I ever wanted for you." "And for you?" she asked. He reached across and took her hand in the way he had taken it 100 times by now, in the kitchen garden and on horseback and across supper tables, and in the warm dark of their room when the ranch was quiet and the stars were out, and the gesture was the same as it had always been, complete and certain and containing everything. "Everything I wanted," he said. Clara took a teaching position the following year in San Antonio, at the academy that had trained her, teaching natural sciences to girls who reminded her of herself at 9 years old, bright and hungry, and in need of someone to take their questions seriously. She came home twice a year, at Christmas and in the summer, and every visit was a festival of noise and energy and the particular happiness of a family that does not take its own completeness for granted. Thomas, at 9, was learning the ranch the way his father had taught him, from the ground up, not as an inheritor but as a student, understanding that the land and the cattle and the horses were living things that required knowledge and care and respect. He rode out with George every morning with the seriousness of a boy who has decided he knows what he wants, and Pete Dawson told Olive one afternoon, with the affection of a man who has watched 2 generations of this family, that the boy had his father's instincts and his mother's intelligence, and was going to be formidable. Nora, at 4, had begun telling everyone she intended to be a doctor. This was not, Olive reflected, entirely surprising. She had been reading to Nora from her own small collection of books since Nora was in the cradle, and Nora had absorbed it all with the particular receptiveness of a child who processes stories as instruction. She had also, the previous summer, witnessed the veterinarian treating a horse's injured leg with a focus so intent that the veterinarian had commented on it, and had thereafter asked George every question about the horse's health that it was possible to ask until George had suggested, with tactful but genuine firmness, that perhaps she might want to save some questions for the next visit. "She can be a doctor," Olive told George when he reported this. "It is 1887, he said. "Women who are doctors have a difficult path." "Clara had a difficult path," Olive said. "She walked it anyway. It is in the blood." He looked at her with the expression that meant he knew she was right and was calculating whether there was any reason to suggest otherwise, and finding none. "I suppose we had better buy more medical books," he said. "I have already written to the bookshop in San Antonio," Olive said. He laughed then, the full real laugh that was still rare enough to be precious, the one that reached his eyes and changed his face entirely, and Olive watched him and thought, with the same thought she had every time, that it was still the most wonderful thing she had ever seen, and that she intended to spend the rest of her life earning it. The ranch was quiet in the evenings now, in the particular good way of a quiet earned and inhabited fully. The windmill still turned above the water tank, and the cottonwoods along the creek were taller now than they had been when Olive first arrived, grown in the years alongside everything else, and the main house, white-painted and solid against the enormous Texas sky, contained within it everything she had not known she was riding west to find, when she accepted Eleanor Fitch's telegram on a Tuesday in the spring of 1878, and said yes without quite knowing yet that she was saying yes to all of it. To the sky and the land and the work and the life, and the man at the end of his porch, with the rain on distant hills eyes who could not stop looking at her. She was in the kitchen garden one evening in the last light of a September afternoon, 9 years after that first September when she had arrived with her borrowed trunk, and George came across the yard and stood at the garden gate the way he had stood that first time, and she straightened from the earth and looked at him and saw in his face the same thing she always saw there, and felt in herself the same answer she had always felt. "Supper is ready," he said. "I am coming," she said. She came through the gate and he put his hand at her back the way he always did, that steady, warm hand, and they walked toward the house together while the September light turned everything amber and the windmill turned in the distance, and from inside the house came the sounds of their children, Thomas's laughter and Nora's precise and serious voice, and the smell of supper, and the smell of the house and the smell of home. Everything was as it should be. Everything was exactly as it should be. And the West, enormous and uncontainable and full of the particular grace of things that are exactly what they are, held them in its tremendous light and its tremendous sky and its tremendous ongoing fact of everything that is possible when you are brave enough to say yes to the right thing at the right time. Olive Aldridge, who was Olive Maddox now, who had come west as a companion for a rancher's daughter, and found that the rancher couldn't stop looking at her and that she couldn't stop looking back, pressed her hand against her husband's at her back and felt the warmth of it and thought, with a full and certain heart, that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. She always had been. She had simply needed to get on the train,